A 20-year-old American soldier lies alone in an open field under a sky torn apart by gunfire. 3 German machine gun nests have him and his brothers locked in a killing zone with nowhere to hide and no way out. In the next 2 hours, he will make a decision that breaks every rule he was ever taught about staying alive in combat. He will become human bait. He will draw the fury of 52 enemy soldiers directly onto himself, and he will kill them all. This is the story of Private First Class Alton Warren Nappenburgger, and the moment he turned himself into a target to save every man behind him. The Italian countryside near Cisterna di Latina stretched out in deceptive stillness on the first day of February 1944. Winter had stripped the fields bare, leaving nothing but frozen earth and skeletal vegetation that offered no shelter to the living or the dead. The 3rd Infantry Division had been grinding through Italy for months, clawing their way up from Sicily through terrain that seemed designed by hell itself to favor defenders over attackers. Every ridge concealed artillery. Every farmhouse hid snipers. Every open field became a graveyard. Alton Warren Nappenburgger was not supposed to be here. None of them were. But the Anzio Beachhead operation had devoured men at a rate that transformed planning into dark comedy. And now his platoon moved in a dispersed patrol formation across ground that felt wrong from the first step. The 20-year-old rifleman from Spring Mound, Pennsylvania, carried a Browning automatic rifle that weighed nearly 20 pounds when fully loaded, a weapon that made him simultaneously invaluable and vulnerable. Bar gunners drew enemy fire like blood draws sharks. Everyone knew this. The Germans knew to kill the bar gunner first, because one man with that weapon could suppress an entire squad if he knew what he was doing. Alton knew what he was doing. Before the war found him, he had spent his youth in the hardwood forests around Spring Mound, moving through dense Pennsylvania wilderness with the patience of something wild and predatory. His father had taught him to hunt deer not through aggression, but through understanding, to read terrain the way some men read books, to know instinctively where an animal would move before it moved there. He learned to wait. He learned stillness. He learned that patience was not passive but actively aggressive, a form of violence held in suspension until the perfect moment for release. These were not lessons the army taught. These were older lessons, carved into him by 1,000 hours of solitary hunting in woods where mistakes meant going home empty-handed instead of dead. The army had taken that foundation and built something lethal on top of it. Basic training had been predictable: obstacle courses, rifle ranges, bayonet drills conducted with theatrical aggression that bore little resemblance to the actual violence waiting in Europe. Then came assignment to the 3rd Infantry Division, an organization that measured its history in campaigns and casualty rates, and specialized weapons training that transformed him from a rifleman into a bar gunner. The Browning automatic rifle was not a precision instrument. It was a 20-round magazine of sustained firepower designed to put so much lead downrange that accuracy became a secondary consideration. Point it at a problem, hold the trigger, remove the problem. Simple. Except nothing in Italy was simple. The patrol had moved into the open field without adequate reconnaissance, because there were never enough men for adequate reconnaissance. Half-strength platoons operated on quarter rations of intelligence and full doses of hope that this particular stretch of ground would not be the one where everything went catastrophically wrong. That hope died the moment the first MG42 opened fire. German machine guns did not sound like American weapons. The MG42 fired at 1,200 rounds per minute, a rate so rapid that individual shots blurred into a continuous tearing sound that men called Hitler's buzzsaw. One burst could cut a man in half. 3 machine guns firing in coordinated crossfire could erase an entire platoon in seconds. The Germans had positioned them perfectly, interlocking fields of fire that turned the open ground into a geometry of death, where every angle led to bullets, and every direction promised the same result. Men went down immediately. Not dramatically, not with the theatrical deaths that civilians imagined when they thought about war. They simply stopped being vertical and became horizontal, sometimes still moving, sometimes already gone beyond any movement except the involuntary kind. The survivors flattened themselves against earth that offered no real protection, pressing their bodies into shallow depressions that were psychologically comforting but tactically worthless. You cannot make yourself small enough to escape machine gun fire in open ground. You can only make yourself still enough that the gunners might choose other targets first. Alton went flat with the others, his bar pressed against frozen dirt, his mind already working through problems that had no good solutions. The patrol was pinned. Movement in any direction meant death. Staying here meant death slightly postponed. Radio calls would bring artillery eventually, but eventually meant minutes or hours, and men were dying in seconds. The machine gun nests were invisible from ground level, their positions marked only by muzzle flash and the direction from which tracer rounds originated. Somebody needed to locate them precisely. Somebody needed to suppress them long enough for the survivors to withdraw or advance. Somebody needed to draw enemy attention away from the men bleeding out in the frozen mud. Doctrine was clear on this situation. Use cover, stay low, coordinate fire and movement in small teams. Never expose yourself unnecessarily. Never make yourself a target. Never sacrifice position for visibility unless absolutely tactically justified. Alton Nappenburgger looked at the small, elevated mound approximately 60 yards ahead and made a decision that contradicted every tactical principle the army had taught him. The mound was not impressive, perhaps 18 inches higher than the surrounding field, maybe 6 feet across, covered in dead grass and offering concealment that would evaporate the instant anyone fired from it. It was also the only terrain feature within running distance that would provide elevated observation of the German positions. From ground level, the machine gun nests were invisible. From that mound, they would be mapped, identified, vulnerable. The mound would also make him visible to every German weapon within 500 yards. He did not consult his sergeants. There was no time for discussions or committee decisions about who would volunteer for the task nobody should volunteer for. He simply began to move, crawling forward with his bar cradled against his chest, using elbows and knees to propel himself across frozen earth, while 3 machine guns searched the field for targets worth killing. Every yard took forever. Every second expected the impact that would end everything instantly. The weight of the bar made crawling harder. The ammunition belts draped across his body caught on vegetation. His breathing sounded impossibly loud in his own ears, each exhalation convinced that this was the breath that would draw attention, that would get him killed before he reached the position he absolutely had to reach. He made it to the mound, pulled himself up the slight incline, and immediately understood both the advantage he had gained and the price it would cost. From 18 inches of elevation, the battlefield transformed. The 3 German machine gun nests resolved from invisible threats into specific positions, with specific fields of fire and specific vulnerabilities. The nearest was perhaps 100 yards distant, positioned behind a low stone wall with overhead cover that protected the crew from artillery, but left them exposed to direct fire from anyone foolish enough to engage them from an elevated position. The second nest occupied a shallow crater to the left, its weapon trained to interlock fire with the first position. The third held the right flank, slightly more distant, creating the crossfire that had trapped the American patrol so effectively. Alton settled the bar against his shoulder, selected his first target, and opened fire. The Browning automatic rifle had particular characteristics that rewarded skill and punished incompetence. Hold the trigger too long and the muzzle climbed, wasting ammunition into empty sky. Fire too conservatively, and you failed to suppress the target. Alton had learned in training and refined in combat the rhythm that made the weapon effective. Short bursts, 4 to 6 rounds, enough to keep heads down and destroy equipment without emptying the magazine prematurely. He put his first burst directly into the nearest machine gun nest, saw the impacts tear through the position, adjusted slightly, fired again. The German gunners had not expected counterfire from an elevated position, because no sane American would expose himself that way. Their tactical assumptions became fatal errors. The first nest took concentrated fire that killed or wounded the crew and destroyed the MG42, removing 1/3 of the crossfire that had pinned the patrol. Alton traversed to the second position without pause, his muscle memory managing the bar, while his hunter's instincts managed the battlefield. This was not fundamentally different from taking deer in Pennsylvania forests. Identify the target, control your breathing, squeeze the trigger, follow through. Except deer did not return fire. The second and third machine gun nests recognized the threat and redirected their weapons toward the small elevated mound, where one American with a bar had transformed himself into the most urgent problem requiring immediate solution. Bullets tore through the air around Alton with that distinctive crack that meant rounds were passing within feet, within inches, close enough that the displacement of air became physically tangible. He shifted position slightly, moving just enough to spoil their aim without abandoning the elevation that made him effective. The ground around him erupted in small geysers of frozen earth as German machine gun fire searched for the exact point where he had been seconds earlier. He put another burst into the second nest, saw movement cease, traversed to the third. The third position was more distant and better protected, its crew now fully alert to the threat and concentrating their fire with professional discipline that turned the air around Alton's position into a continuously lethal environment. Tracer rounds drew bright lines through the dimming afternoon light, each one marking the trajectory of 4 additional rounds invisible to the naked eye. He could see the tracers converging on his location with geometric precision that left no doubt about German intentions or capabilities. They were very good at what they did. They would kill him shortly unless he killed them first. He fired, adjusted, fired again. The bar's magazine ran dry and he changed it with mechanical efficiency born from repetition, fingers performing the reload sequence while his eyes tracked targets and his brain calculated angles. The third position continued firing, disciplined bursts that showed the crew had not yet been neutralized. He returned fire with controlled aggression, walking rounds across their position until something critical failed inside the German nest and the firing stopped. Then the Germans sent infantry. Alton saw them emerge from positions he had not previously identified, perhaps 20 men moving in a flanking maneuver designed to envelope the exposed American position from multiple directions simultaneously. They advanced with competent tactical movement, using whatever minimal cover existed, laying down suppressive fire that forced him to keep his head down while assault teams closed the distance. This was Doctrine. This was how you eliminated a stationary threat. Fix him in place with fire, flank with infantry, close distance, kill him. He had perhaps 90 seconds before they reached effective grenade range. The elevated position that gave him visibility also made him visible, but it provided something more valuable than concealment. It provided fields of fire. The Germans had to cross open ground to reach him, and open ground meant exposure, and exposure to a bar gunner who knew exactly how to use terrain meant casualties that mounted faster than momentum could overcome. Alton traversed his weapon across the approaching infantry, fired controlled bursts into their advancing line, watched men fall or go to ground, or reconsider the tactical wisdom of assaulting a fortified position across open terrain under direct fire. He was not trying to kill them all. He was trying to break their attack, to impose sufficient casualties that the assault lost cohesion and momentum. The bar excelled at this particular task. Its sustained fire created a beaten zone that turned specific areas of ground into locations where human beings ceased to exist as functional entities. The German infantry assault wavered, then broke, survivors retreating to covered positions where they could regroup and plan their next attempt. Alton used the respite to inventory ammunition and evaluate his tactical situation with the cold calculus of someone who understood exactly how temporary his survival had become. The bar magazines he carried were nearly exhausted. The German infantry would assault again, probably with greater numbers and better coordination. The machine gun nests were suppressed but not necessarily destroyed. His exposed position grew more untenable with each passing minute. Then he saw the fallen American rifleman approximately 20 yards distant, lying motionless in the open field with ammunition pouches still attached to his webbing. Leaving the elevated position meant abandoning the only advantage that had kept him alive. It also meant potential access to additional ammunition that could extend his ability to suppress enemy positions and protect the patrol. Alton calculated odds, distances, timing. He slid down from the mound and began crawling toward the dead soldier with the same patient aggression that had carried him across the field initially. Every yard exposed him to German fire. Every second expected discovery and immediate death. He reached the body, pulled ammunition from webbing pouches with hands that functioned despite the adrenaline, extracted stripper clips and loose rounds, and anything that could feed the bar. The dead soldier's face was turned away from him, which was fortunate because looking at faces made things harder than they needed to be. He gathered what ammunition existed, began the crawl back to the mound, made it perhaps halfway before German fire discovered him, and turned the surrounding earth into chaos. Rounds impacted close enough to throw frozen dirt against his face. He flattened completely, pressed himself into microscopic terrain features that could not possibly provide actual protection, but which the human brain insisted were better than nothing. Machine gun fire traversed across his position with mechanical efficiency, searching in a pattern that would inevitably intersect with his specific location shortly. He waited for the momentary pause that always came when gunners reloaded or adjusted position, then scrambled the remaining distance to the mound and pulled himself back up to firing position. Reloading the bar from loose rounds and stripper clips while under fire required a particular kind of focus that excluded everything except the immediate mechanical task. Hands performed sequences they had practiced 10,000 times. Rounds went into magazines. Magazines went into the weapon. The bolt cycled forward and chambered around and made the bar ready to continue doing what it did exceptionally well. The German infantry came again. This assault showed more caution and better coordination, teams moving by bounds while support elements provided covering fire that kept Alton suppressed and unable to engage freely. They had learned from the first failed attack. They were adapting their tactics to the specific threat he represented. The assault developed from multiple directions simultaneously, spreading his attention across a wider arc than one man could effectively cover. He engaged the closest threat first, put bursts into approaching infantry that forced them to ground or killed them outright, traversed to the next threat, fired, moved his position slightly to avoid the return fire that inevitably followed, The Mound provided elevation but limited mobility, and German fire was beginning to bracket his position with increasing accuracy. Rounds impacted close enough that fragmentation from bullet strikes against stone, and frozen earth drew blood from his face and hands in small cuts that he barely registered. Time became elastic and meaningless. The assault could have lasted minutes or hours. Reality compressed into the continuous cycle of target identification and engagement, magazine changes, momentary assessment of tactical situation, return to firing. The Germans kept coming because they had numerical advantage and doctrinal certainty that mass and momentum would eventually overcome isolated resistance. Alton kept firing because stopping meant dying and taking the entire patrol with him, into whatever waited on the other side. Then something shifted in the German attack. The infantry assault lost coordination. Return fire became sporadic. Movement ceased. Alton maintained his position and continued engaging targets until no targets remained visible, then scanned the battlefield for threats that might have withdrawn to covered positions for regrouping. The third machine gun nest, previously suppressed but still functional, had gone silent. He did not immediately understand what had changed. His ears rang from sustained exposure to gunfire at close range, creating a distorted audio environment where nothing sounded correct. His vision had narrowed to tunnel focus that excluded peripheral awareness. He maintained firing position, weapon ready, searching for the next threat that must inevitably appear because threats always appeared and combat never simply ended cleanly. Behind him, he heard American voices calling commands and coordinates with the particular urgency of men who had suddenly regained tactical mobility. The patrol was moving. The survivors were advancing or withdrawing or repositioning, executing whatever tactical plan had become possible because 3 German machine gun nests no longer dominated the terrain with interlocking fields of fire. Alton remained on the mound, covering their movement, maintaining suppressive fire against positions that might still harbor viable German resistance. He fired into likely enemy locations with disciplined bursts until the patrol had moved clear of the killing zone, until officers called him back, until maintaining his position served no further tactical purpose. He descended from the mound carefully, expecting German snipers or hidden positions to reveal themselves during his withdrawal. Nothing happened. The Germans had withdrawn or died, or simply ceased to function as coherent fighting force in this particular sector. The patrol consolidated in a defensive position beyond the open field, performing immediate action drills and casualty assessment with mechanical efficiency that came from repetition and training, and the necessity of continuing to function regardless of what had just occurred. Alton Nappenburgger, age 20, from Spring Mount, Pennsylvania, who had spent 2 hours as the single most important target in this small corner of the Italian campaign, walked past men who looked at him with expressions that combined respect and incomprehension, and the particular knowledge that what he had done violated every tactical principle, while simultaneously achieving results that Doctrine could not have accomplished. Somebody counted German casualties when positions were overrun in subsequent advances. The estimates varied but settled eventually on 52 enemy soldiers killed, or wounded by 1 bar gunner, firing from an elevated position that Doctrine said should have gotten him killed in the first 30 seconds. The recommendation for the Medal of Honor came through channels with unusual speed, processed by officers who understood that certain actions transcended normal recognition and required acknowledgement at the highest level. The citation would eventually describe the tactical situation, the impossible odds, the 2 hours of sustained combat against multiple German positions, the 52 enemy casualties. the suppression of 3 machine gun nests, the defeat of multiple infantry assaults. The words would be formal and precise, and completely inadequate to convey what had actually occurred in that frozen field where one man decided that making himself a target was the only way to stop being trapped. The medal ceremony happened later, in a different place, with generals and photographers and formal language about valor and sacrifice and service above self. Alton stood at attention and accepted the decoration with the same quiet competence he brought to every task, neither minimizing what he had done nor inflating it beyond the simple fact that men needed help, and he provided it in the way available to him at that specific moment. The Army designated his actions as training material, case studies in adaptive tactics, and the importance of individual initiative when Doctrine failed to address battlefield reality. Officers lectured about terrain analysis and the calculated acceptance of risk. Trainers taught bar gunners about sustained fire discipline and target prioritization. The story became educational content, sterilized and formalized and reduced to tactical lessons that could be transmitted to subsequent generations of soldiers who might face similar circumstances. But the men who had been in that patrol, who had lain pinned in that frozen field while German machine guns destroyed everything that moved, who had watched one man crawl forward to an exposed position and draw all the fury of the enemy directly onto himself so they could live, they carried a different understanding that required no formal language or official documentation. They knew what it looked like when someone decided your life was worth more than his own. The war continued. Italy gave way to France. France gave way to Germany. The 3rd Infantry Division accumulated campaign credits and casualty statistics with equal efficiency. Alton Nappenburgger continued functioning as a bar gunner, performing his assigned duties with the same quiet competence that had characterized his actions in that field near Cisterna di Latina, neither seeking additional recognition nor avoiding situations where similar actions might become necessary. He survived. Not everyone did. The division lost men at rates that transformed units into continuously rotating collections of strangers, where veteran soldiers became increasingly rare and valuable resources. Alton became one of those rare veterans, someone who had seen enough combat to understand its actual nature rather than its theoretical representation, who could teach younger replacements the practical skills that textbooks could not convey. He taught them about patience, about reading terrain, about the moment when doctrine becomes obstacle rather than guidance, and individual judgment becomes the only resource available. When the war ended, he returned to Spring Mount carrying memories and scars, and the particular knowledge that comes from doing things civilians cannot imagine and would not believe if described accurately. The transition from combat soldier to civilian was neither smooth nor simple. Men who had functioned effectively in environments where death was continuous background noise often struggled in peacetime society, where normal problems seemed trivial and normal fears seemed incomprehensible. Alton found his way back through hunting. The Pennsylvania forests welcomed him without questions or expectations or need for explanation. He taught his children to hunt, passing down the lessons his father had taught him, the same lessons that had kept him alive when staying alive required more than luck or equipment or tactical training. Patience, terrain analysis, the ability to wait, the discipline to take the shot only when the shot was right. These were not metaphors. These were practical skills with practical applications that had nothing to do with war and everything to do with understanding how the natural world functioned. He did not speak much about the war. Veterans rarely do, at least not to people who were not there. The experiences were too specific, too intense, too far outside normal human existence to translate effectively into civilian language. Words failed. Stories became inadequate. The reality of lying on a small mound of frozen earth, while 52 German soldiers tried to kill him, could not be accurately conveyed to someone whose greatest daily fear involved traffic or job security or social embarrassment. So he lived quietly. He fished. He hunted. He taught grandchildren the same skills his grandfather had taught him, creating continuity across generations that had nothing to do with combat and everything to do with patient observation of the natural world. The Medal of Honor stayed in a drawer, brought out occasionally for formal events or school presentations, but never displayed prominently because the actions it represented were not something requiring continuous acknowledgement or pride or public celebration. They were simply what needed doing at the time they needed doing. Alton Warren Nappenburgger died in 2008 at age 84. Having lived nearly 6 decades beyond that February afternoon in Italy when he transformed himself into human bait to save his brothers in arms. The obituaries mentioned the Medal of Honor and his military service, and the family he left behind. They did not mention, because they could not adequately describe, the specific quality of courage required to crawl forward into enemy fire when every instinct and every training principle commanded you to stay down and stay hidden. They did not mention that 52 German soldiers had died trying to kill one American, who refused to accept that his survival mattered more than the survival of the men depending on him. They did not mention that sometimes the difference between catastrophic defeat and survival comes down to one individual who looks at an impossible situation and decides that doctrine is advisory rather than mandatory, that staying alive is less important than keeping others alive, that making yourself the target is the only way to remove the target from everyone else. The lesson his story teaches is not about heroism in the abstract sense that civilians understand heroism. It is about the specific calculus performed in specific moments when all options are terrible, and the least terrible option requires accepting your own probable death as the price for giving others a chance at living. It is about the cold mathematics of combat where one life spent correctly can preserve many lives, where sacrificing position for visibility becomes tactically sound, where breaking every rule becomes the only way to achieve the mission. It is about a 20-year-old hunter from Pennsylvania who understood patience and terrain, and the critical moment when action becomes more important than survival, who spent 2 hours as the most important target on a frozen battlefield, who killed or wounded 52 enemy soldiers not from hatred or aggression, but from the simple necessity of protecting the men who trusted him to do something when nothing seemed possible. And it is about the fact that 65 years later, his story remains relevant not because war has changed, but because the fundamental human questions war poses have not changed and will not change. What would you sacrifice for strangers who depend on you? When would you accept death to prevent the deaths of others? How much courage exists in the moment between recognizing what must be done and actually doing it despite knowing the cost? Alton Nappenburgger answered those questions on February 1, 1944, in a frozen field in Italy, with a Browning automatic rifle and the lessons learned from hunting deer in Pennsylvania forests. He made himself the target so 52 Germans would focus on killing him instead of killing his brothers. He survived. They did not. And because of that, men who should have died in that field lived long enough to go home and have families and grow old, and tell their children about the quiet rifleman from Spring Mount who decided their lives were worth more than his own. So here is the question this story leaves you with. the one that has no easy answer and requires genuine consideration rather than reflexive response. If you found yourself in that frozen field, pinned by enemy fire with no good options and diminishing time, would you have the courage to crawl forward into the violence? Would you make yourself the target? Would you accept death as probable outcome if it gave strangers a chance at survival? Or would you stay down, stay hidden, stay alive for 30 more seconds or 30 more minutes until the mathematics of combat reached their inevitable conclusion? Think about that. Then subscribe to this channel. Leave a like if this story moved you or taught you something worth knowing, and tell me in the comments, was Alton Nappenburger's decision heroic or suicidal? Where is the line between courage and recklessness when all options lead to probable death, and the only variable is who dies first? I want to hear your perspective on the impossible choices men face, when war removes every easy answer and leaves only terrible options, and the necessity of choosing anyway.